I'm not sure why they came, these wise men from the east. After all, why should they, who are not Jews, who are not from Judah, not from Israel, but rather from the somewhat undefined east, come to pay homage to the King of the Jews? I don't know why they came, but Matthew tells us they did indeed come, seeking the King of the Jews. And so they come to Jerusalem, the capital city of Judah, a logical place to look for a child that was to be born King of the Jews. Once there, however, they discover that there already is a King of the Jews. His name is Herod, and he has not recently had a son. Herod does not receive their announcement that a new King of the Jews has been born as good news. In fact, when he hears that an infant is challenging his throne, mighty King Herod is frightened. He is scared of a baby. Now, to understand why the great King Herod would be frightened of an infant pretender to his throne, we must first understand that Herod is an insecure king. Herod rules Israel. He sits on what was once the throne of David, but he was not born an Israelite. In fact, he was born an Edomite. He lacks the ethnic and religious credentials that the religiously observant in Jerusalem deem necessary to be the king of Israel. This lack of religious legitimacy is made most obvious by the fact that neither God nor the Jewish people anointed Herod king of the Jews. He was given that title by a vote of the Roman Senate. To secure, Herod rules not by the favor of God, but by the favor of Rome. To secure their favor, Rome asks only that he keep the region stable, that he prevent any and all revolts or uprisings, like, say, the kind of revolt that could result from people getting all riled up about the birth of a new, true king of Israel. Herod reacts with fear to the news of the Messiah's birth because it exposes his vulnerability, a vulnerability that he spends all his life trying to cover up. Seeking to secure his vulnerable position, Herod sends the wise men along to Bethlehem, the supposed birthplace of the Messiah, to find the child. And guided by a star, the wise men locate the infant Jesus and are overcome with joy. They fall to their knees to worship the baby and give him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. What exactly an infant would do with gold, frankincense, and myrrh, I am unsure. To tell the truth, I'm not entirely sure what myrrh is. But there they are, presenting these incredible gifts to an infant, worshiping an infant. The whole idea of worshiping an infant has always struck me as a bit odd. There's a scene in a Will Ferrell movie called Talladega Nights where Will Ferrell's character is sitting at the dinner table with his family and he begins to pray in the following fashion. Dear 6-pound, 8-ounce little baby Jesus, in your crib with your developmental videos. It's funny, it's a parody, of course, but it is what we do every Christmas, right? All of us come and we declare that God has become incarnate in an infant human being. That God, who we otherwise view as omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient, is fully present in an infant. Now, it strikes me as ridiculous to worship an infant for the same reason that it seems ridiculous that King Herod should be afraid of one. I do not have an infant of my own, but I've been privileged enough to hold the infants of friends and family on occasion. And the one overwhelming characteristic of infants that has struck me each time I've held one is their vulnerability. Infants are vulnerable. They cannot care for themselves. They cannot feed themselves. They cannot defend themselves. They cannot walk. They cannot even hold their own oversized heads up. They are helpless. They are overwhelmingly vulnerable. And yet, we associate this particular helpless infant with the God who created the cosmos. At our Advent retreat this past year, I was sharing my perplexity about the worship of an infant with a member of FCCB. And as I was making the point about babies being vulnerable, he looked at me and laughed. You see, his wife and he had recently had a baby, and vulnerability was very much on his mind, but not in the way that I had been discussing it. When I mentioned vulnerability, he thought not of his baby, but of himself. Having a child, a vulnerable infant, had exposed his own vulnerability. He so loves that helpless infant, is so totally invested in her life and happiness that he would do anything for her. This man, who before the birth of his child felt largely self-sufficient, for the most part in control of his life and future, is now completely at the whim of a vulnerable, helpless infant. He is now every bit as vulnerable as she is. And perhaps that is why we love these little infants. Perhaps we see in their vulnerability a reflection of our own. For each of us was at one time an infant, a vulnerable, helpless infant. And have we really shed so much of that vulnerability? Can any of us truly say that we are self-sufficient, that we are in control? We rely on others to meet our needs because they are simply too great to be met alone. We form relationships with other people. We make families and communities and nations so that we might help one another to meet our needs. And in so doing, we often form bonds of love. We come to love those people that we are in relationship with. And while it's great that these communities can help us to meet our needs, that these relationships teach us about love, they also make us even more vulnerable. Because to love a vulnerable person is to make yourself vulnerable, to reveal that you are every bit as vulnerable as they. And once you felt that love, a love of being true and honest and open, the love that a parent feels for a child, there is no going back. Parents can't simply decide to give up loving their children. They may complain at times about their babies, especially when they enter their teenage years, but they are simply incapable of not loving them, of being as they were before the baby entered the world.